Democracy or deception in the DRC? An opposition candidate wins the presidency, but was a backroom deal made? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Felix Tshisekedi. For the first time in almost 2 decades, the Democratic Republic of Congo has seen a transfer of power. But the results have been marred by the deaths of protesters and accusations of fraud, even though an opposition member won.
First of all, I wish to thank God, the master of time and circumstances, who allowed for such an event which a few weeks ago was still unimaginable. That's why I follow it directly, and I know many of you find it hard to accept. But I say with sincerity, I pay homage to President Joseph Kabila, President of the Republic.
Well, Felix Tshisekedi has been declared the next president. The ruling party has even accepted the outcome. But rival opposition leader Martin Fayulu, who had been well ahead in opinion polls, has called the results a sham. Critics have accused Tshisekedi and longtime President Joseph Kabila of making a power-sharing deal behind closed doors. Well, to discuss this, let's go to our panel. In London, we have Vava Tampa, the founder of the civil society organization Save the Congo. And in Canterbury, we have Alex Ntung. He's an independent DRC analyst. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Vava, let me start with you. Felix Tshisekedi, as the next leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo, do you recognize that? Was that a legitimate win?
I tell you what, I find myself in such an incredibly huge dilemma. I've always defined myself politically or philosophically at least as a Tshisekedist, which is essentially believing in the idea of état de droit, or the state of law, the rule of law. So I believed in what his father stood for. But in this situation, we find ourselves in a situation in which the Catholic Church, which sent the largest observer mission on this election, have actually said, this is not the right result. That Kabila and Tshisekedi have made a deal to declare Tshisekedi a winner. And the question for people like me is, what would happen to ordinary people? What does Kabila get from this deal? And what would Tshisekedi essentially do in the days to come? So I find myself in a situation in which I'm going to wait until the final result are finally released for me to make up my mind. But I'm not yet ready to sort of jump and scream with joy as some other people are doing. Alex Ntung, can you relate to that dilemma that Vava's currently in?
I do certainly relate to Vava's dilemma. There is something we need to understand of what happened yesterday. Kabila has played many cards. Beginning, he was hoping that he will continue to postpone elections. Secondly, he was hoping that the opposition will continue to be divided. And thirdly, he was hoping that the opposition will boycott the elections due to the electronic machines. And all the three options did not work. Fourthly, he was hoping that by excluding 3 towns, Yumbi, Butembo, and Beni, again, the opposition will boycott the elections. That did not happen. Again, something incredibly well played by the opposition. And fourthly, he was hoping, lastly, he was hoping that the fact that he's on control of all institutions, of course, also part of FCC being the largest political network that Congo has ever experienced. Again, he was hoping that Shadari will be able to win and they will be able to influence elections. The defeat was deep, and there was no way that all those options would be used. And lastly, of course, as Vava has just mentioned, Senko has been incredibly behind what has been going on. But what is happening now, it isn't a win of Tshisekedi, but instead it is Tshisekedi being handed over the power, by FCC. So there have been suddenly some sort of agreement that has gone on rather than actually
certainly, but we can't be certain, Alex, we can't be certain that there was a deal, right? This is everybody guessing at this moment in time, right?
What's the sources on the ground? We saw some changes from Tshisekedi tweeting and homage to Kabila. He's saying that unity and reconciliation. That was a completely different tone from UDP's leader. Somehow, that's led to some conclusion that there is a possibility that Kabila is going to be holding some of the biggest ministries, for example, defense and the police, and possibly justice and primacy or prime minister.
Yeah, one of the comments made by Tshisekedi that Alex is referring to was, "I pay tribute to President Joseph Kabila, and today we should no longer see him as an adversary, but rather a partner in democratic change in our country." We spoke about the Catholic Church, Vava. Now, they said the results didn't match with their data. And based on all the available evidence, their data said that Mr. Fayulu won, Martin Fayulu. Let's have a little listen to what he had to say very recently.
We categorically reject the result published by Mr. Nanga. May God Almighty bless the Congo.
So, Vava, Fayulu categorically rejects it. What does that mean? Is there going to be trouble on the streets?
Well, there is potential for trouble, and this time the potential for trouble is bigger and greater, and perhaps even more bloody than we've ever experienced. Look, what Kabila must also give him some credit, because his people are fascinatingly clever. This was an incredibly clever move. They understood if they had declared Shadari as winner. Shadari is Kabila's cousin. He's a former interior minister, and he was also the head of Kabila's political party. If they had declared him the winner, the entire country would have risen up in arms to overthrow Kabila through the street, and they would have lost everything else. Now, they knew clearly they could not have declared Martin Fayulu the winner, who is, according to the Catholic Church, the legitimate winner, because Fayulu essentially, I mean, look, what we are fighting for here, you need to bear in mind, is good governance. And that good governance only comes when politicians are accountable, when the people are actually le souverain premier. A French way to sort of say the people actually decide who wins. So they couldn't declare Fayulu the winner, so they had to strike a deal. And the deal is how to essentially allow the system, the very system that had killed hundreds of thousands of millions of Congolese people, and today the 10th is actually exactly 7 months today. I lost a friend of mine, Luc Kulula, who was fighting for this change and democracy in Congo. So how do you create some sort of facade situations in which the system continues, but under a different guise? But that's one thing, but we need to bear in mind, this is not the end. This is simply the beginning of this crisis, because there is a chance in the next couple of days, this will be challenged in the Constitutional Court, and if those Supreme Court judges have any sense whatsoever, they would certainly essentially nullify the result, order a new election, which means Kabila stays as president, but crucially, it means Kabila stays as president with some sort of legitimacy, because he would say to the world, but look, we organized election. It wasn't perfect, of course, but look, Tshisekedi, an opposition figure, was declared the winner, and the Constitutional Court came in and sort of said that wasn't good enough, so I'm staying to organize another election. And again, the humanitarian crisis, the killings of our people continues. So it's an incredibly tricky situation for the Congolese people and for the whole region as a whole.
Alex Ntung, do you agree that this could just be the very beginning of a crisis?
Not fully. I don't fully agree with that. I think today something which we were expecting is, violence across the country. Yes, there have been some report, for example, in the Back Congo, in the Kwilu area, and there have been some victims as soon as the report came out. But what is likely to happen instead, what Vava just mentioned, is that there is a last card that Kabila is going to be playing. The last card is that the election's result will be challenged, most likely to be challenged, and by Martin Fayulu, and he has 10 days to do that. If a constitutional court allows Martin Fayulu that actually there have been irregularities, they are likely to actually accept in favor of Kabila. They are actually to accept that. In that case, obviously, they may lead to some sort of dialogue. Dialogue will lead to transition, and transition may be led by Kabila. And we may have to see again Kabila for another year or 8 months. But something which we need to mention to conclude that is that Fayulu have been excluded for 3 factors. One, the fact that he has a link with 2 big supporters, Moise Katumbi and Jean-Pierre Bemba, and secondly, the fact that he has links with the external powers, and that has played a big factor. And of course, 3, the Catholic Church has been incredibly vocal and behind, showing that they support Martin Fayulu. Those 3 factors have been one of the biggest fears Kabila's camp had to deal with. Accepting Shadari to lose, that's one thing, but accepting Fayulu to win, that is something they could not accept.
Vava, come in.
Alex is, as often he does, sort of advocating for Kabila. He seems to be a fan of that regime for reasons I've never understood. He has essentially repeated what I said. But crucially, look, the reason I mentioned that this is a very tricky situation, because now, and I've spoken to many people at home and many people across the world, now what you see within the Congolese community is the frustration that were initially directed toward Kabila and his people is no longer being directed against Kabila and his people. Is not being directed against Tshisekedi and his people for the simplest reason. Tshisekedi is seen, and it seems quite clear to everyone that he has betrayed our fight for change. He has become an ally of Kabila. And you need to ask yourself basic questions. I mean, why would you have to promise Kabila for Kabila to accept you to replace him? For Kabila to accept Tshisekedi to become the next president, and you need to bear in mind Tshisekedi's father is still, he died 2 years ago. His body is still in Brussels, in exile, because Kabila doesn't want it to return home to be buried at home. Now, for Kabila to refuse his own cousin to replace him and to give that seat to Tshisekedi, my God, I'm asking myself, what must have been promised to Kabila? Okay. But let's put that aside. My fear, what really concerns me, what really worries me, is the frustration which is being directed against Tshisekedi and his people. And if that is not managed, what we would see over the next coming days or coming weeks or months even, is essentially an internal fight between the people from Tshisekedi's tribe fighting against other people at home, and the only winner in that situation will be Kabila. I think eventually we need to come together, unite, and sort of say, Kabila must go. There is no question that Kabila could stay. Kabila has to go, but not just Kabila, it's the entire system. And if Felix attempts to somehow save that system, he would fall down with that system. And that is not a threat. That is essentially a promise. Those are factual. Right. We would not allow it to continue. We would not allow it to go ahead.
Okay, so Alex, is that where you fundamentally disagree with Vava, that he is against Kabila in any sort of role, whether as an ally to Tshisekedi or someone who still has to keep hold of the controls for the next year or 18 months if the election results are annulled? He's against it in all forms. He says after 18 years, time's up, you need to go. Are you less keen on that? Are you comfortable with Kabila still staying in power in some form?
No, totally no. We know that, looking at the evaluation of what Kabila has done, the country is still facing 136 armed groups operating in Eastern Congo. Kabila will talk about, unifying the country because of that. The time he took over, it was divided into two with RCD Goma and RCD Kisangani. That's why he said that led to Sun City agreement. But before during 1996 to now, many armed groups have been being created every day. The country economy is still really devastating. So people want to change.
Alex, let me ask you this question. Ask you this question. Clearly, do you think Tshisekedi won the election?
I've said from my first responses, I said that it doesn't look like it has been a winning election. It has been rather handing over power to Tshisekedi
Alex,
as an alternative.
If you feel that's the case, then ask yourself a question. Why has Kabila made a deal with Tshisekedi? What has Tshisekedi promised Kabila? Or what Kabila gains from this deal? Can you answer that question?
I can answer that question.
Okay, sure. And we'll make that the final word. Go ahead, Alex.
We need to go back to the 8th of August, the day that Kabila chose Shadari as his dauphin, as we say. We know that all analysts, we know that it was to protect his legacy, to protect his future, to make sure that he has someone that he will be able to control, he has someone he will be able to manage. And that has not happened, and based on many other scenarios and strategies that he's been using. And the last scenario was last night, being able to negotiate with Tshisekedi and to come up with the least contentious leader that he would be able to face.
Right. Gentlemen,
he would have wanted to win.
I think,
gentlemen, listen, Vava and Alex.
Let's come back quickly.
Right, okay, very briefly, please, because we're completely out of time. I have to ask for extra time. So
for us, we've always said the best way forward has always been a civilian transition without any politician, led by Denis Mukwege, because he's an independent, neutral leader, civic leader, so that we can organize good elections. And this is a perfect example. And God save my people, because I'm really frightened for the future. I've never felt so frightened about what's going to happen to my people.
Gentlemen, please come back on the show. We love having you. We're going to be talking about DRC very soon. Again, Vava Tampa and Alex Ntung for the moment. Let me thank you. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the program, Nicolas Maduro begins a new term as Venezuela's president. But could political unrest and international pressure cause him to step down? And Iran's president may have more than 2 million followers on Instagram, but that's not stopping his government from moving to ban the app.
Juro por el legado de nuestro amado comandante Hugo Chávez. Juro.
He was flanked by his friends, but it could be a lonely 6 more years at the top for President Nicolas Maduro. He's starting a new term in Venezuela after claiming to have won an election last year that dozens of countries don't recognize.
We urge Nicolas Maduro not to assume the presidency, to respect the responsibilities of the National Assembly, and to provisionally transfer power until new elections are held.
Maduro has long presided over a country in crisis. Inflation has risen to nearly 1 million% since he took over from Hugo Chavez almost 6 years ago. For most Venezuelans, medicine and food have become scarce and unaffordable.
The health situation in Venezuela right now is the worst situation of the health system in the history of Venezuela's republic.
Around 2 million people, nearly 10% of the country's population, have fled to neighboring Colombia, Brazil, and further afield. But Maduro says he's the victim of a US-led conspiracy to overthrow him and that he'll fight to stay in power.
Está en marcha un golpe de Estado ordenado desde Washington, ordenado desde el cartel de Lima contra el gobierno legítimo y constitucional que yo presido. El pueblo venezolano sabrá responder cualquier intentona, cualquier acción que se pretenda hoy, mañana o cuando se pretenda.
Despite calls both at home and abroad to step down, Nicolás Maduro has the upper hand. He controls the presidency. He's appointed loyalists to the Supreme Court and the Electoral Council. The army has repeatedly pledged allegiance to Maduro and his militarized brand of socialism. In return, the military has been given control over the state oil company PDVSA. But the National Assembly is mostly made up of opposition lawmakers, and last year, Maduro appointed a constituent assembly made up of his loyalists to overrule it. Despite massive anti-government protests in 2017 that led to hundreds of protesters killed, Venezuela's opposition parties have struggled to challenge Maduro. They're split on whether political negotiations or aggressive pressure on the government is the way out. Their latest hope is a new president in the National Assembly who says he's determined to bring change.
This is a victory that will be a happy one, when we manage to strengthen and unite all of us to challenge the government and the regime.
But the real pressure might come from abroad. The US and EU could step up financial restrictions against people and companies in Maduro's inner circle. The sanctions have already limited the government's access to foreign currency, which Venezuela depends on to import all major goods. Skeptics, though, say that Maduro could weather the storm. Venezuela's government is being propped up by Cuba, billions of dollars in loans from China, and Russian military hardware. Maduro may choose to radicalize his so-called Bolivarian revolution.
La milicia nacional bolivariana ha llegado a 1.600.000 milicianos y milicianas en armas para defender la paz de la República.
A path that some fear could trigger violence and more misery on the streets. Sandra Gottman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Merida, Venezuela, by Paul Dobson. He's a journalist at Venezuela Analysis. In Caracas, we have Phil Gunson, a senior Venezuela analyst at the International Crisis Group. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Pedro Mario Borelli. He's a former executive board member of Venezuela's state-owned oil firm, the largest company in Latin America at the time. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Pedro Mario Borelli, let me start with you. Second term for Maduro, 6 more years. Does he deserve it?
Well, he doesn't deserve it because a way to become president is to hold free and fair elections. And what happened in May 20th was neither free nor fair. And that is the real problem that we're dealing with today. This is the end of a first period, an election that he won, also quite contested, with a lot of doubts about how the vote was counted then. So clearly, if you wanted to get a second mandate, he should have gone through a proper election where everybody who wanted to participate could participate, where the rules were clear, where the Electoral Council had been elected in the form that the Constitution mandates. So we're dealing with a crisis that is man-made. It's made by one man, Nicolás Maduro, who opted to stay in power by playing with institutions and using the institutions of democracy in order to perpetuate himself in power. That's the crisis we have.
Paul Dobson, the man doesn't have a mandate from his people, and he's created a crisis in the country. He shouldn't have another 6 years, according to the other guests. What do you think?
Well, I find it quite ironic that the fact that the electoral system hasn't changed in Venezuela significantly over the last 7 to 8 years, yet certain spokesperson, including your last guest, choose to recognize some elections but not others. We're using the same electoral system we've used in Venezuela for the last few years, for the Electoral Assembly elections in 2015, for example, and a series of other elections. And all of the international observers, independent international observers who are here on the ground, unlike your previous guest, who I understand wasn't in Venezuela at the time, the people who were here, who inspected the electoral system in May, decided that it was free, fair, transparent, and independent as an electoral system. Therefore, the results can be trusted to be the genuine results of the Venezuelan people.
The real problem in the country right now, no matter who you speak to, Phil Gunson, is that the economy is a wreck and people are suffering. Now, I guess the main point of division here is whether Maduro wrecked it or it was a medley of forces both inside and outside. Where do you stand on this, Phil?
Well, if you look at what has happened since Maduro came to power, the economy has shrunk by around 50%, and we now have inflation of well over 1,000,000% a year. It's hard to see how he can escape responsibility for that. But of course, the problems didn't begin with Maduro. They began a long time ago with Chavez, his predecessor and political mentor, who opted for an economic policy which, although during the period of high oil prices it was possible to maintain, disguising the underlying problems, once the oil price fell and the problems accumulated, the chickens came home to roost, if you like. And Maduro, on the one hand, has inherited what Chavez produced and what Chavez laid the groundwork for, and on the other, he's successively failed, despite repeatedly promising a fresh economic package. He's repeatedly failed to resolve the problems that have arisen.
I want to have a little listen to a Venezuelan migrant, someone fleeing the country, Dario Lea. I'll have a little listen, everyone, and we'll pick up after that.
Over there in Venezuela, there is no life at all. With the wages, you can't even afford to buy some soap, to take a shower. Nothing. Even if you have 2, 3, 4 different wages, it's not enough.
Paul Dobson, the place seems to be quite unlivable for hundreds of thousands of people, even millions of people. And to what extent can you accept that those in charge are responsible for this?
Without a doubt, those in charge have got to put their hands up and take their share of the responsibility for the current economic situation. Very rarely will you hear in the international press the fact that they actually do this. In a very recent interview only a week ago, the president recognized that there are economic failings of his mandate. I don't think anyone is contesting this. Where we maybe would differ in is looking at the original causes of the situation and the solutions. For example, I would agree with what your previous speaker, Philip, mentioned, that Maduro has in fact inherited a lot of these problems from Chavez. But I would also add that Chavez inherited a lot of these problems from the 40 years of right-wing governments before him. The number one problem causing the Venezuelan economic situation is that Venezuela is heavily dependent on oil. That is the situation. It produces almost nothing else and has to import everything that it consumes. This means that it's dependent on exchange rates, it dependent on international trade, and a whole range of other factors, which haven't helped in creating a solution when the oil price is dipped.
Okay, so let me ask Pedro. So Pedro, you have the sanctions coming from the United States and the West, right? Cash shortages as a result of that, meaning they can't produce the oil that they need in order to spur the economy. Isn't the West partly to blame here?
Not at all. The reason the real sanction that has been imposed on Venezuela, and as the previous guest said, a highly dependent country on oil, made even more dependent by the fact that all other sectors of the economy were destroyed by Hugo Chavez by expropriating agricultural land, expropriating businesses. I mean, this is a country that has one of the best agricultural land in the world and doesn't produce any food. Why is that? Because the government went out on a massive expropriation. They actually prefer to import food. As a matter of fact, today, they are importing food from Turkey after having spent some time importing food from Mexico and others under very corrupt schemes. Once those schemes were discovered, they've now moved to do those out of Turkey. The real problem here is not sanctions. The real problem here is the economic management. Hugo Chavez fired 23,000 people, the top management of that company that the country depended on. There are consequences. Those consequences, we're seeing them right now. When Chavez arrived in power, we delivered to him a company that produced 3.3 million barrels of oil. Today, it produces barely 1 million at incredibly high cost. And of course, that is not enough to maintain a country that's wholly dependent. But to blame that on sanctions, when the guy who's running the oil company right now is a National Guard general with zero experience, and they actually have turned this company into one of the biggest money laundering operations in the world. Come on, okay? The sanctions that should be imposed on PDVSA should have even been stronger, given that they moved from producing oil to laundering the profits of Latin American drug cartels. That's the reality of what's going on, and that's why it's producing 1 million barrels of oil. Not enough to maintain a country, much less a country that is not producing any food, because Chavez preferred to destroy the sector and get his military friends rich by importing food rather than whatever. But when you run out of foreign exchange, you cannot import food.
Paul
That's
Dobson?
the problem.
Yes, well, it's certain elements of this are true, but it's also worth pointing out that Venezuela didn't produce food before Chavez either. Venezuela has been dependent on oil since the 1930s, more or less, with an ever-increasing frequency. This isn't a new phenomenon. This phenomenon has come from a long time before. And it's worth pointing out that the fires, the amount of people that the government had to sack from the oil industry was due to a coup d'etat, which they tried to launch against the country. It was a crime carried out by a number of people in the oil industry, and logically they were fired from their posts because of this.
Phil Gunson, at the International Crisis Group, your mandate is to try and put out fires, to analyze problems and to come up with solutions, right? We look at the Lima Group, 13 of the 14 in the Lima Group, not very happy with Maduro, don't recognize this new 6-year mandate. Only Mexico, left-leaning government, saying we won't stick our noses in other people's businesses. Looking at the zeitgeist, when we see that we have Donald Trump as the US president, we have Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Ivan Duque in Colombia, all of them no friends to Maduro, is it helpful or harmful that they're taking a tough stance on him?
I think it's inevitable that they're going to take a tough stance on him, and it's appropriate that they should. I mean, the hemisphere decided in the framework of the Organization of American States some time ago that being a democracy was a condition for being recognized and treated as an equal in the Americas. And clearly what we have now in Venezuela doesn't meet those criteria. They should be taking it seriously, and they should be adopting a tough stance, not least because in many cases, and you mentioned Colombia and Brazil in particular, they are receiving tens of thousands, in the case of Colombia, over 1 million refugees from Venezuela. Their own countries, their own economies are suffering. And they need a solution to this. Now, is that on its own enough? No, certainly not. It's impossible, I think, for the outside world to fix the problem of Venezuela unless there's an internal partner, if you like. And the problem has been in the recent past that the opposition has not come together around a coherent plan in coordination with external critics that would permit the restoration of democracy. And that's one of the things that needs to be fixed, I think.
Pedro Mario Borelli, with the current pieces on the board, that constitutional assembly that was set up by Maduro, Maduro's presidency, himself, would you have any trust in those institutions to reform from within?
I think it's impossible, and I think we've actually come. I mean, we're talking about as if nothing's going to happen in the next few days. I think it is very significant that Maduro will not be recognized by a number of people, and that maybe the government that emerges from the legitimate National Assembly, which, by the way, disagreeing a little bit with what Phil just said right now, was the result of the opposition getting together and gaining control of the parliament. And it is that fact that Maduro did not accept that the opposition won the parliament. He went in to gut that parliament to create this parallel illegal structure called the National Constituent Assembly. I mean, this is a fight that we've had. This fight really exacerbated the moment the opposition finally got together and got the majority of the National Assembly. That should have led to a negotiation, to a cohabitation, to some sort of cooperation, but it actually led to even more radicalization on the part of the government. So clearly what we have right now, as we're speaking, because it is the 10th of January, which is when Maduro's term ends, and suddenly we understand that there is no recognized elected president. And it is important what I'm saying. The fact that Maduro can hold on and usurp power creates a problem because he will not be recognized. And then we have a challenge. What if the world opts, the largest, all the regional powers, and Europe decides to recognize Mr. Guaido, who is the president of the legitimate National Assembly, which everybody recognizes as the sole legitimate institution at this point. This is the crisis that we're dealing with today. It's a crisis between somebody who opts to usurp power from midnight tonight to the fact that the legitimate, under the Venezuelan constitution, the legitimate steps are that the National Assembly has to name a president to fill the vacuum. And that president has to be, in the first instance, the president of the National Assembly. So in the next 24 hours, we're bound to find this clash between a guy who does not want to leave and an international community that is mostly and principally in terms of the countries that affect Venezuela, aligned with the possibility of recognizing a government that emerges from the National Assembly.
Paul Dobson, does it feel to you like that clash is imminent?
I would say no. I mean, your previous speaker used the word legitimate a lot. Anyone who uses this word, I presume, has read the Venezuelan constitution, which was passed the year after he left the country. And according to the Venezuelan constitution, the National Constituent Assembly is perfectly legal. The National Assembly, which was elected under the same electoral system which was used in May, I should point out, has been declared in contempt of court for around 3 years now. And the president assuming power after elections is also completely legitimate and within Venezuelan law. The question here is, legitimate according to who? Legitimate according to American standards, Trump standards, and so on, or legitimate according to Venezuelan law under the principles of the international law of self-determination and according to the Venezuelans' people's right to choose? This is a question which is being debated at the moment in Venezuela. And the people in Venezuela there's a vivid debate going on, both within the opposition sectors, the pro-government sectors, on the streets, in the offices, and so on. No? But the only true way to judge this debate is in the elections. And we can see in the elections that the vast majority of the people who oppose the government either chose not to vote, or have left the country, or have not registered to vote, or voted for one of the 3 opposition candidates who ran against Maduro in May.
Well, there's a lot of pain at the moment, economic suffering that is beating into political issues right now. There are major issues facing Venezuela right now. We'll be keeping a close eye on the country. For the moment, gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Paul Dobson, Phil Gunson, and Pedro Mario Borelli. Thanks again. Iran is preparing to block Instagram, the only major social media outlet still freely available in the country. But many are asking, what's the point? President Hassan Rouhani and Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei have some of the most Insta followers of any world leader. And many high-ranking officials flout the bans on Facebook and Twitter, just like millions of ordinary citizens do by using VPN routers. The government says social media is being used to attack the country's national security. Critics say the real attack is by the government on free speech. So what effect will an Instagram ban have? That debate in a moment. But first, here's Shoaib Hassan.
The opposition in Iran says it's the latest move to stifle dissent, a decision by the Supreme Cyberspace Council to start blocking the use of Instagram. It follows a ban on the messaging app Telegram in April last year. In the Middle East's most populous nation, Facebook, Twitter and YouTube are already blocked. Authorities barred access to those social networks after they were used to galvanize anti-government protests in 2009. Iranian leadership says the ban is to prevent what it calls the spread of immorality and breakdown of law and order, and that it's got nothing to do with repressing dissent.
این نکته باید برای همه روشن باشه که ما ملت آزادی هستیم و طبق قانون اساسی و حقوق شهروندی مردم در بیان انتقادشون و حتی اعتراضشون کاملا آزاد هستند.
Iran has come under an increasing number of sanctions since US President Donald Trump tore up a nuclear peace deal with the country in 2018. Its leaders say they are also the target of a cyber campaign to destabilize the country. But at the same time, many of Iran's most powerful figures, like Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and President Hassan Rouhani, himself maintains social media accounts with millions of followers. Some critics say the government is only interested in shutting down the social media services domestically to rein in the increasingly unhappy and disenchanted youth.
I was one of those who several years ago told my friends they must vote because it will allow us to demand things. But now I see we can't do anything.
It's this growing sense of alienation and anger that the current government feels needs to be contained. But many analysts believe that a ban to stifle such sentiment cannot be fully implemented in practice and may actually backfire. So, is the proposed ban going to work? Or will it only lead to more frustrated Iranians on the streets? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Jerusalem is Holly Douglas. She's a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East Security Initiative. In Lahore, we have journalist Khanis Fatima. And in Washington, D.C., independent cybersecurity analyst Nima Fatemi. I thank you all for joining us on The Newsmakers. Holly, let me start with you. The Iranian government wants to ban Instagram. Tell me why they want to do it and why now.
Well, this is actually something that surprised a lot of us right now, a year after the December 2017, January 2018 Iran protests. What we've been seeing for the past year is that ever since the ban on Telegram in April of 2018, a lot of Iranians have been using VPNs to access Telegram, which is one of the more popular messaging apps with about over 40 to 56 million users. But because of this ban, it's also become more problematic for Iranians to access it. So they've been actually resorting to Instagram. And what have they been using Instagram for? They've been using it for doing advertisements, whether it's for selling clothes, teeth whitening products, but they've also been using it to become Instagram famous or Insta famous by posting parody videos, modeling pictures, I would say along the lines of jokes, even jokes about the clerical establishment. But over the course of this past year, we've also seen that these Instagram accounts, some which range from 300 to 500,000 users, are also now posting protest videos and a lot of criticism of the Iranian government, including the Aghazadas, the children of the elite, where you find that these Iranian government officials' children are posting personal things like their wedding. The Iranian ambassador to Denmark's daughter-in-law posted videos of a wedding that she recently had with their son. And this wedding cost a lot more than it would cost for the average Iranian, and there was a lot of criticism about it. We've seen Iranian government officials posting their outfits, their designer clothes.
And let's just hold that for just a second, Holly, because that's an interesting point, right? Because a lot of people look back to the late 70s, and one of the reasons for the revolution was the inequality, right? So that's fascinating. But Nima Fatemi, let me ask you the very basic technical question. If people can get a VPN, why do they even bother? Is it actually going to work?
Yes, so when we look at it, to me, it's actually not a new trend that Iran has decided to block another social media app. Basically, for as long as my generation has lived and remember, Iran has been always trying to gatekeep the access to information, basically to flow of information. So this is yet another thing, right? The thing is, we also saw this happening when they blocked Telegram, right? So when they blocked Telegram, a lot of people started using proxies and whatnot. So what Iran did, they actually started developing some of the some basic clients of Telegram in which that they were not banned, such as Golden Telegram or Telegram Talai or Hotgram. And these apps were basically essentially used to monitor and censor the content that were basically flowing around in the Telegram channel. So from what I see, this is a matter of gatekeeping that information and making sure that basically looking at how information is being flowing around and having access to control and monitor and surveil people as they are using the social medias. For instance, when you basically try to search for a VPN in Iran, when you use Google, when you search in Farsi, and the first few search results that you get are basically not censored in Iran, and you can go in there and use your Iranian bank account to actually purchase a VPN that actually works. And it makes me wonder who is managing those VPN servers, right? Because when you manage those VPN servers, you can basically have access to the traffic of the users. And the other thing that is, I think, is very, very important to look at is the economy of censorship, right? So when you look at it, with the new laws that they've been passing, basically they get users in Iran right now. Iranian users, when they subscribe for internet access, they have to purchase internet based on the speed limit and also the volume limit, which is not usual around the world. That if you download like 2 movies or like watch too many videos on internet, you're already being penalized. And then there is another thing that has been added, that the Iranian system has decided that if you use any services or any like basically access any servers that are not inside Iran, you are again penalized. You have to pay double to access those. Like for any megabytes, your each megabyte basically is considered 2 megabytes, right? Yeah. And then when you use like these services, you basically essentially pay more to access the same things that you were accessing before. So essentially, I think this is aimed to the working class and the lower middle class, because those are the only people who can't afford to pay the extra amount to have access to this information.
Yeah, so
additionally,
hold on, just for a second. Nima, just a sec, right? Thanks for painting the picture, and of course also it's really interesting that you say, sometimes you might need a VPN for your VPN because you don't know who's running it, right? Kaniz, Fatima, let's big picture look at Instagram, because we know the leadership is on Instagram. Hassan Rouhani is on Instagram, more than 2 million followers. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, if you tally up the Farsi with the English, it's about 2.8 million altogether. At what point did they go, if this is them at all, this is not a good social media application and we don't want it in our country anymore? What was the tipping point? Was there a tipping point where they started to see this as a national security threat?
Right. Now, it depends on how you explain or define a national security threat. As you've just mentioned, a lot of the Iranian officials are on Instagram. Someone in Iran has an Instagram account. And over the years, as I've noticed, specifically since the filtering of Telegram, we've seen more and more people use Instagram and the different features that it provides, be it its questions or its polls or even its live broadcasting feature. And they've been using it in different ways to gain greater audiences. And as your earlier guest pointed out as well, this has created a platform where debates can happen in a very depoliticized way between people on social, economic, and political issues. Now, these movements cannot be easily dismissed by calling them foreign infiltration or calling them paid agents of the West. These are grassroots movements of average Iranians who have a stake in the future of their country and who continue to profess, many of them, their loyalty to the ideals of the Islamic Revolution. So these aren't outside foreign threats, as, for example, maybe with the filtering of Telegram went, where there was that issue that there are channels on Telegram that are being used by foreign agents to instigate violence and dissent. But on Instagram, what you're seeing are grassroots Iranians who are saying that there is a problem with corruption in the country. Right. We don't want a regime change. We just want a system of governance which represents our values and that looks out for us. So therein lies that problem where the Iranian authorities, or as I would call them, the old guard, the politicians who've been in power for decades now and have sort of been looking towards remaining in power and using those positions of strength for their own personal gains, these movements and the platform that Instagram provides them and the questions that then come up is a threat for them. Okay. It becomes then a matter of national security for them.
Okay, so to them that is, the mere discussion is a national security threat rather than actual mobilization. Interesting distinction being made there, and interesting to see that from their perspective, or to try to guess that from their perspective. Holly Dagres, is it like a game of whack-a-mole where they're going to push Instagram down, but something else will bubble up as a platform for discussion? Is that how it works?
I think you essentially hit the nail on the head, and I'll explain why. Before Telegram was a thing, it was Viber. And before it was Viber, it was WhatsApp. So with Iranians, historically speaking, whether it's something of a social media or a messaging application or day-to-day, they figured out when there's a will, there's a way. If Iranians find that they can't use certain applications, they're going to find another one that's not being filtered, or they'll just resort to using VPNs, which is what they've been doing for years with Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube since the 2009 post-election protest known as the Green Movement. So I think for Iranians, this is merely an obstacle, and they will always find a way around this obstacle.
Two final comments from both Nima and Kaniz. Nima?
Like, maybe this is the point that they started to actually look into blocking these social medias, is that just like how our other fellow panelists mentioned, that like all these government officials have been using all these social medias, like look at how many of them are actually actively using Twitter, for example, which has been blocked since 2009. Like the Supreme leader himself has like 2 verified accounts in Farsi and English, and they continue to tweet in different languages. So I think what's happening here is that they want to control the flow of information, and like what like that's like one part of it, that they see that when we see that like different things come up on social media, such as like torture of this worker, for example, Esmail Bakhshi, which started to become a trend to a point that the state media had to cover it, and after that the parliament had to do some sort of, like, at least they said that they are going to do basically an investigation to understand like what was going on, which that investigation totally failed and they didn't do it. But they like it forced them to react to that to that conversation. So I think that's like one of the issues. And the other thing is that while all of these elites basically have unfiltered access to this, they just want to restrict the lower class and the working class, which is basically taking the bigger hit in the current society, in the current economic economy of the country and in the society that we have right now. So I think this is a way of basically controlling the crisis and damage control of the Islamic Republic, as it's basically failing on so many different grounds. So people cannot, like, they are just basically trying to slow down the narrative of basically the discourse between the people, like as people mentioned, which
Nima,
has been always restricted by the Iranian government.
I've got to wrap in less than a minute. Let me get a final comment from Kaniz. Kaniz, very briefly, please.
Well, I think it would be interesting to see how the discourse develops. It's not just Instagram. It's about the platform that it provided for conversations to happen, for engagement to take place, because it's quite clear that Iranian viewers are not finding that on their national media or being reflected amongst government branches that claim to speak for themselves. So it will be interesting to see what tools then will be used to have those conversations and to develop that discourse further, which goes further from just speaking and engagement towards actual action in bringing out the kind of reforms and political changes that the Iranian people want to see in their system of governance.
Okay. Nima Fatemi, Holly Dagres, and Kaniz Fatima. For the moment, I've got to move on. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.